Hey, what's going on, guys? It's me, Jay. Um, I just wanted to do this short little video. We did the video on wrestling, um, but I wanted to do a video on wrestling from wrestling history from antiquity to the pioneer era. In the pioneer era, I put roughly the 1840s after this. The 1840s, right before the Civil War, to about the 18, I mean the to 1905, the first um, heavyweight title fight. In Kaminsky Park between George Hackenschmidt and Frank Gotch. Okay, so where do we begin? Wrestling is the oldest sport in the world. There are wrestlers there's wrestling mentioned in every civilization, in every culture. You have wrestlers mentioned in the Mahabharata, the ancient Indian text, the Hindu text. You have wrestlers mentioned in the Old Testament of the Bible, such as when Jacob wrestles with the angel. You have wrestling mentioned in the Iliad, in the Odyssey. You have wrestlers mentioned in the labors of Hercules, for example. So nobody really knows where it began. As old as human literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh, for example, you have wrestling. But as far as a competitive sport, I would say that wrestling roughly began when the Olympics began in 776 BC. It was an Olympic sport. The Olympics, for those that don't know, was a festival that the ancient Greeks had that honored the pantheon of gods, the Olympic gods, mostly Zeus, and they incorporated wrestling, and it went on like this for centuries in Greece, and eventually, when Rome became a thing and Roman power became ascendant, and all the Greek territories of the Ptolemaic Empire and the Seleucid Empire, the descendants of Alexander the Great and his power over the Mediterranean when he rose to power after the 330s. The Romans took over, and the Romans continued the practice of not only wrestling, not only grappling, but also the Greek art of pancration, which is a combination of strikes and grappling. And it was just something that everyone did until Christianity became a thing. And Christianity had a problem, of course, with the Olympic Games, being as though the Olympic Games honored Greek gods and they didn't honor the Christian God. It was a form of paganism as they saw it, and they didn't like it. They hated it. So uh, Constantine legalizes Christianity in 313 AD, and then he becomes a Christian himself. What is the first Christian emperor, Theodosius the First, who bans wrestling in 339 AD. No more wrestling. So wrestling in the Christian world went underground throughout the Middle Ages, throughout the Renaissance period, and basically up to the modern era. The last wrestler to win in the Olympics was this man in the picture in the thumbnail, Milo the Croatan. He was from Croatan in Italy. He was the last wrestler to win in the Olympic Games. What happens though? Eventually, in the 19th century, during the Napoleonic Wars of the 19th century, a man named Jean Esperance, one of Napoleon's generals, decides to revive the ancient tradition of wrestling, and he invents Greco-Roman wrestling. And Greco-Roman, even he himself went under the name the Colossus, because just like today, the wrestlers back then adopted grandiose names for themselves, are harkening back to the ancient Greco-Roman heritage of wrestling. But that didn't sit well with the entire world. the British, the British and the English-speaking world invented their own style of wrestling that they evolved out of folk wrestling, particularly Lancashire wrestling. And this style of wrestling was called catch as catch can wrestling. In other words, it didn't have as many rules or as many restrictions as its French counterpart. It was more free. And you could, in the beginning, you could use strikes, believe it or not. But, and this was developed by the English. In a place called Wigan, England, the Snake Pit. And it incorporated uh, grappling techniques from far-flung places that England was involved with, like Japan, Japanese Jiu-Jitsu, as well as um, as well as Indian Pelwani. A fellow by the name of oh yeah, a fellow by the name of Tom Cannon went to India, traveled to India, and learned the art of Pelwani. And although he was defeated, he brought those techniques back to England. So that style caught on, and that style also caught on in the United States. Now, another individual by the name of William Muldoon in the 1840s, a veteran of the Napoleonic, a veteran of the not the Napoleonic Wars, the Franco-Prussian Wars in the 1870s. Decided that he was going to try to bring Greco-Roman wrestling to the United States, but it never caught on in the United States. The English style, caught on further. And you even had famous American presidents like Theodore Roosevelt and Abraham Lincoln claimed to be wrestlers. In fact, Abraham Lincoln had a tremendous wrestling record, even becoming the first United States champion in the 1830s. Now, by the time the 1890s comes around, you have the style of wrestling that was pioneered by the English, freestyle. John Graham's Chambers, the same individual, developed the modern techniques for modern boxing. And you have, this is 1896, the modern Olympics. And they decide to include first Greco-Roman wrestling, and then in 1904, they decide to include freestyle wrestling. And they develop the rules and the techniques for wrestling. But what else is happening? Wrestling in Europe is gaining a lot of traction. An individual by the name of George Hackenschmidt, the Russian Lion, is popping up on the scene. And in 1900, he defeats the then United States champion, Tom Jenkins, and he becomes the first world heavyweight champion of wrestling. But by 1905, Martin Farmer Burns, and his pupil Frank Gotch are spreading the gospel of catch as catch can wrestling, and they want to challenge the champion George Hackenschmidt to a title fight. So in 1905, in Comiskey Park in Chicago, Illinois. You have Russia versus the United States. Uh, Up to this point, all the champions in wrestling, all the great champions in wrestling have either been Indian or they've been European. But by 1905, Frank Gotch captures the the attention of the nation, and he defeats George Hackishman, and he becomes the first American to capture the championship. Now, by 1911, the two would have a rematch, and the rematch was disputed. It went on for hours and hours, like 3 or 4 hours, right? And the rematch was disputed because during a sparring session that Hackishman was having with a shooter, a hooker named Ed Santel, hookers were specialists in illegal holds that you couldn't use in standard wrestling competitions, illegal submission holds. Well, he was just sparring with him, right? And this guy, Ed Santel, supposedly injured Hackerschmidt. So although Hackerschmidt lost, the fight was called into heavy, the legitimacy of the fight was called into question, you know? So here you have the lineage of the World Heavyweight Championship going from the early 1800s to the French guy Paul Pons. He was the first international champion, which wasn't the world champion. And then you have George Hackerschmidt in 1905, the first world heavyweight champion. And then you have Frank Gotch. Frank Gotch, it remains undefeated. Frank Gotch does not lose the championship. He retires as champion in 1913. And by that time, fans start to lose interest in the sport. The sport is seen as too long. They prefer boxing. The pugilism of boxing is far more exciting. Now, boxing was similar in that it came out of antiquity, something that people did in the initial stages of boxing before the institution of the Marks of Queensberry rules, before 1889. There wasn't boxing, there was prize fighting. And prize fighting incorporated strikes and takedowns, as well as some submissions. Because during this fight, it was a fight in Mississippi between Jake Kilrain and then champion, the Boston Strongboy, John L. Sullivan, 1889. Uh, John L. Sullivan, was trained by that guy I said before, the Greco-Roman wrestler William Muldoon, who became Greco-Roman wrestling champion in 1845. So boxing in the beginning was different, but then by the late 1800s, early 1900s, boxing had just gone to just punching because people found the grappling techniques for boxers to be boring. So wrestling, they felt like wrestling. If they found that to be boring in boxing, of course they would find it to be boring in wrestling. So fans after Frank, and there were no big stars to capture the fans' attention like the way that Frank Gotch did, right? Frank Gotch, his personality loomed so big over the sport that once he retired, and then shortly after died from aremic poisoning, fans felt like they were never going to get a champion like that back ever again. So once again, wrestling died and went underground, and had to return to its humble origins at athletic shows and carnivals. It became kind of married to the carnival circuit throughout the United States. And that's the pioneer era of wrestling. From there, we'll go on to talk about tomorrow. Yeah, we'll definitely bring up that name, David. David brings up Lou Thez. Lou Thez was the first world heavyweight champion of the modern era. Because what happened to the world heavyweight championship after 1913, the retirement of Frank Gotch? Well, it got passed around because there weren't really promotions necessarily. What happened was a group of promoters to make wrestling popular again. Three people develop on the scene, and these three are called the Gold Dust Trio. This is Billy Sandow, he's a manager. Ed Ed Strangler Lewis, Robert Frederick, who took his name from a wrestler in the 1800s known as Evan Strangler Lewis, and um, Joseph Tootsmont. They want to start promoting wrestling again, but they want to make it more exciting. So they developed a different style of wrestling called Slam Bam Western Style Wrestling, which is the early ancestor of modern day professional wrestling. They developed the ideas, they developed several holds and techniques, and they developed the ideas such as bookers, promoters, bad guys versus good guys, heels versus baby faces. And yes, Lou Thez, a Hungarian immigrant, is trained by Ed Strangler Lewis, and he becomes world heavyweight champion for the first time in the 1930s, particularly 1935. Under the original banner of the, the first wrestling promotion, because with the way Lewis and Sandow and Tootsmont had it orchestrated, it was just a traveling group, a traveling like circus. There wasn't any real promotion. But by 1930, a national governing body for boxing had already existed, called the National Boxing Association, that was developed in 1920. So they decided if they had this for boxing, they might as well have it for wrestling too. So they developed in 1930 the National Wrestling Association. And yes, David is correct. Lou Thez becomes uh, one of the first champions of this era by defeating Edward Carpentier, a famous wrestler from Montreal. In this promotion, this National Wrestling Association, there's two difference there. There's the National Wrestling Alliance, and then there's the National Wrestling Association. The association is older than the alliance. The association started in 1930. The alliance doesn't start until 1948. So the National Wrestling Association remains intact with its headquarters in New Orleans, Louisiana. But there are disputes even with that because by the 30s, showmen, especially the early 30s, showmen Jim, like Jim Landos, become popular, and Landos, he held the record in Madison Square Garden in the 30s for the most sellouts. Now, think of how incredible this is before Thez. Think of how incredible that was. We're talking about the 1930s, the era of the Great Depression. People don't really have disposable income like that, yet he was still able to sell out Madison Square Garden more than any other professional athlete at the time, even more than most boxers. Boxing in the 1930s was struggling up until Joe Louis becomes popular in the late 30s, in like 38. But Jim Landos, the Golden Greek, Jim Landos was the biggest well-known athlete. So he kind of revived professional wrestling in the United States when he won the world title for the first time in 1932. But David is right as far as the modern history of wrestling, as far as like from 1948 onward, Lou Thesz is the guy because what eventually happens, there's so many disputes with the National Wrestling Association, it becomes ineffective. So the promoters around the country decide to form a combine of of basically, and they get together and they decide to form like a version of the mafia, an alliance, if you will, the National Wrestling Alliance in Waterloo, Iowa, in 1948. And you have Pinky George, you have um, he's from the Cleveland territory. You have um, different ones. Orville Brown from Cincinnati, all, all over the country. It's like five or six guys, and they decide who's going to be the first champion. And they decide on Orville Brown, but Orville Brown gets into a car accident, so they decide to unify the National Wrestling Association Championship, which is held by Thesz, with the National Wrestling Alliance Championship, which was held by Orville Brown, by having Thesz win it. And Thesz remains the champion for years and years because he's a legitimate shooter. Nobody can actually beat him. He was trained by Ed the Strangler Lewis. So, like I said, by 1935, he captures that version of the NWA Championship. But by 1939, he's basically capturing all the championships because by 39, he captures the American Wrestling Association Championship, the original AWA, because there was an AWA, there's a later AWA that was founded by Vern Gagne in 1960. But there's a first AWA that was founded by a promoter named Paul Bowser, based out of Boston, Massachusetts, that existed from in the 1920s and 30s. So Thesz captures that championship in 1937 by defeating Everett Marshall. But and Thesz Thesz is actually Thesz is actually one of the first big stars, like David is saying, of wrestling, because in 1952 he competes. He defeats Baron Leone in Olympic Auditorium for the first sellout in Los Angeles history. So, and we're getting into the early television era. By the time we get to the television era, that's when we're talking about stars in the next video, like Vern Gagne, stars um, like Lou Thesz, like Hans Schmidt, like um, Gorgeous George, the Toast of the Coast. Those individuals. That's in the next installment. And the beginning of the influence of promoters like Fred Kohler and promoters like Vince McMahon Sr. in wrestling. The McMahons first thought about the McMahons. They first started promoting for professional wrestling initially in the 1920s. Uh, they had started off as boxing promoters in the early 90s. First, they started off in baseball initially, though. Jess McMahon, the grandfather of Vince McMahon, started off as a baseball promoter for the Negro League baseball team, the American, the New York Lincoln Giants, the Negro League baseball team. And from there, they transitioned to boxing, where they promoted in 1915 the first one of the first title defenses overseas of the first black heavyweight champion, Jack Johnson, against uh, Jess Willard in Havana, Cuba. But like I said, by the time the 20s rolled around, boxing kind of, after the retirement of Jack Dempsey, boxing kind of dropped off. You know, you had Depression era boxers like James Braddock. You know what I mean? They weren't doing uh, doing much of anything. So in the late 20s and early 30s, the McMahons got into professional wrestling, and that was around the time when wrestling was beginning to become a work, because they say that the last legitimate professional wrestling match occurred between Stanislaw Zbyszko, a Polish wrestler, and Wayne Munn in 1925. So, um, we don't actually know when the last legitimate professional wrestling match occurred, but yeah, but we're talking about his grandfather, though, David. uh, his grandfather, Jess McMahon, was the one who initially started promoting wrestling in the New York area. Initially, like I said, with boxing, but he started promoting wrestling initially in based out of Long Island, New York. And of course, like if you used to watch the WWF in the 1990s, right, and they would have an opening that said, "For over 50 years, the revolutionary force in sports entertainment," and you will wonder to yourself, well, how can it be 50 years when the WWE was supposedly founded in 1952, right? But the answer is that they're not dating it from 1952 to 1996. Like, this is when they started airing that, 1952 to 1996. They're not dating it from that. They're dating it from 1946 to 1996. And why 1946? Well, Vince McMahon Sr., Vincent James McMahon, gets out of the Army after World War II is over. World War II ends in 1945. So after World War II ends, Vince McMahon Sr. gets out of the Army and he buys the Turner Arena in Washington, D.C. Joe Turner was a promoter, a wrestling and boxing promoter based out of Washington, D.C. Vince Sr. buys that territory, buys Washington, D.C., and converts what they call the Turner Arena into the Capitol Arena, and then begins promoting professional wrestling from there until he's partnered up with Toots Mondt. He's partnered up with the guy that basically created wrestling, because there was a power struggle during the 20s and 30s in the New York area between the former promoter in the New York area, Jack Curley, and Toots Mondt. A lot of promoters didn't like Toots because he went back on his deals and he was a gambler, and that eventually, in the early 70s, that eventually forced him out of the WWE as a partner. But initially from 1946 to when they when they started promoting wrestling to 1952 when they officially founded Capital Sports, and then 1953 when they joined the National Wrestling Alliance. Toots is one of the initial parts of the brain trust that becomes WWE. So Vince's grandfather started promoting wrestling in the 20s. He starts promoting wrestling in the 1920s out of the municipal, what they call the municipal arena in Long Island, New York, with his partner, Carlos Luis Henriquez, based out of Coney Island, New York. And in 1925, he becomes the first McMahon to promote wrestling. But he's bouncing between wrestling and boxing. So he's not really giving his all to wrestling. But the son, Vince McMahon Sr., after he comes out of the army in 46, does give his all to wrestling, buys the Turner Arena in 46, and then with his partner Toots Mondt goes on to found the WWE in 1952 and joined the National Wrestling Alliance in 1953. Then 10 years after that, there is a dispute between the promoters of the NWA. The NWA promoters want to put it on back on the guy that David talked about, Lou Thez, because they feel like Thez. No, David, because that cannot be possible. Because David's saying the WWF champion should have been founded very early in the 1900s. No, because there was no WWF. I mean, I think the McMahons were still in England. I mean, the McMahons were still in Ireland. um, Ireland, pardon me. Um, uh, during the uh, during the time you're talking about, so that's not possible. I mean, it, the titles were merged together. You know what I mean? So maybe you have a point. I mean, you do have a point there because the titles were merged together. But the WWF Championship only goes back to 1963 because what happened was Lou Thesz, the guy um, uh, that David is talking about, that was like the first champion of the National Wrestling Alliance era. He he was never good in New York. First of all, he didn't really want to wrestle for Vince Sr. He wanted to wrestle for other New York promoters because he sided with them in the struggle for New York. So much so that Vince Sr. even incorporated the help of Joe Louis. After Joe Louis retired from boxing, he went into professional wrestling for a while, and and Vince Sr. got his services to appear in the Garden to appear against Lou Thesz, who another promoter was promoting across town. So when he finally does wrestle in the Garden, Thesz doesn't do well in the Garden. For some reason, New Yorkers didn't like Lou Thesz's style, but they did like Nature Boy Buddy Rogers. In 1961, in the same place, Comiskey Park, where you had Hackenschmidt versus Gott in 1905, in 1961, you have a battle between Nature Boy Buddy Rogers and Pat O'Connor. And during this match, Nature Boy Buddy Rogers becomes the NWA champion. And Nature Boy Buddy Rogers, his his reign is good for New York. They like him in New York. He's selling tickets in New York. He's doing his thing in New York, but he's not really selling out in other parts of the country. So the promoters in the NWA, particularly Sam Mushnick, because Lou Thez is based out of St. Louis. No, not the Nature Boy Ric Flair, the Nature Boy Buddy Rogers. Um, Lou Thez is based out of St. Louis, so his promoter is Sam Mushnick. And Sam Mushnick, who's the promoter for the St. Louis Wrestling Club, he has uh, he has a lot of pull. He's the president of the NWA for many years. He wants to put it back on Thez, but McMahon doesn't want that. So what McMahon does is they say that Buddy Rogers never lost it because it wasn't a 2 out of 3 falls match, and most of the championship matches back then were contested under 2 out of 3 falls. So they keep the title on Buddy, but they develop a fictitious story that Buddy won the title in Rio de Janeiro. So according to official WWE history, Buddy Rogers um, won the title in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Even though there was no tournament held in Rio de Janeiro, they just gave him a championship, and that's the beginning of the independence of the WWE. It was called Capital Wrestling Corporation from 1952 to 1963, and was a member of the National Wrestling Alliance, the Northeastern branch, from 1953 to 1963. But by 1963, they changed the name to Worldwide Wrestling Federation, the WWF, and Nature Boy Buddy Rogers is the first champion. And this happened, guys, on April 11th, 1963. But David is correct in a sense that you could say that the WWE Championship does go back to the early 1900s. And why can you say that? Because don't forget, the NWA Championship, right, which has its lineage. Remember, I said the NWA champion. Actually, you could trace the NWA Championship back to the title that Hackenschmidt had in 1905, right, and that Frank Gotch had, right, because and that title then becomes the National Wrestling Association title. Then that other title becomes the National Wrestling Alliance title, and that title, the National Wrestling Alliance title, then becomes the WCW Championship by the time the main branch of the NWA is purchased by Ted Turner in 1988. And then that company, WCW, gets bought out by the WWE in 2001, and Chris Jericho becomes the unified champion in 2001. So in a sense, David is correct. The the title that was started in 1900 is can trace its lineage in to a certain extent to the modern day WWE Championship, if you want to look at it that way. But WWE doesn't do history that far back. They only go back to 1963 with Buddy Rogers. David Summer, the Nature Boy, Ric Flair. Ric Flair, David, is no, it's not the first Nature Boy. He got his name from Buddy Rogers. Buddy Rogers was the first Nature Boy in wrestling. Originally, when Ric Flair broke into to wrestling, training under Vern Gagne in the AWA. Now, where does the AWA fit into this? Like I said, Vern Gagne becomes popular in the 1950s on television, probably the most popular star in the Midwest, more popular than Lou Thesz. And him and Lou Thesz compete in 1953, three times in the early 50s, but the first time is in 1953 for the World Heavyweight Championship. Thesz doesn't want to drop the belt to him. Thesz wants to drop it to his handpicked successor, Dick Hutton. And Gagne feels like, hey, I'm the champion. And the problem is, too, Fred Kohler's TV, based out of Chicago, Illinois, is the most popular wrestling television program in the late 40s and early 50s. But they don't have the champion. The champion almost never, the NWA champion almost never appears on television. So they create their own championship. They create the Omaha State Championship and eventually the United States champion because they need a champion to wrestle. And Gagne does win that. But Gagne wants the world title. So what Gagne does is he says, they're not going to put the belt on me. I'm going to found my own promotion. And he takes the Minnesota territory and he leaves with the Minnesota territory, which is most of the Midwest. He buys it from Tony Stecker. And in 1960, he leaves and he forms the American Wrestling Association. And this works out perfectly for the NWA promoters because something happened in 1956 with regards to the NWA promoters. They were brought to Congress because in the United States, it is illegal. Monopolies, corporate monopolies are illegal, especially back then, because capitalism hadn't run. Neoliberal capitalism hadn't run amok yet. So, so they were going to get shut down if they continue what the United States considered to be a monopoly. So they decided, hey, let Vern Gagne go off and do his own thing. Let Vince McMahon go off in the Midwest, and Vern Gagne in the Midwest and Vince in the Northeast. But both of them still maintained a position in the wrestling mecca, which was St. Louis. You know what I mean? So. So it really didn't matter. It was more of a, keeping up appearances. And Vern, he challenged the champion, Pat O'Connor. Pat O'Connor had 90 days to accept the challenge, and he didn't accept the challenge. So Vern just made himself the champion of the AWA, the first AWA champion of the modern era, found in the American Wrestling Association. And from about 1963 to about 1982, those were basically the three biggest promotions: the National Wrestling Alliance with its various territories, the AWA, and the WWF, until Vince McMahon in 1982 purchased the promotion from his father, and he decided to leave the NWA because, like I said, Toots Mondt, the NWA promoters didn't like him. So when he was partnered up with Vince, they weren't going to let Vince back into the NWA. But when he left in 1971, when he left WWE in 1971, Vince decided to bring his title and to bring his promotion back into the NWA fold. That's why you had matches in 1978 between superstar Billy Graham and Harley Race, or matches in 1981 between Ric Flair and Bob Backlund, matches between the NWA champion and the WWF champion because they were working together again. But by 82, 83, Vince Jr. takes over, and when Vince Jr. takes over, he doesn't want to be part of the NWA anymore, and he leaves the NWA and is never to return again, and vows to basically destroy both the NWA and the AWA. Times have changed in the American government, and no longer are monopolies such a big thing. So he's out to create a national monopoly in wrestling, and that's what he does by first purchasing the Los Angeles territory and then going from there to purchase basically every territory, leaving only Jim Crockett. Jim Crockett Jr., the son of Big Jim Crockett, who was the promoter in the Crockett territory in the Carolinas, he becomes the one and only person to survive Vince McMahon's onslaught. Vince McMahon becomes what Alexander the Great was in the Greco-Roman world, just as Alexander the Great had taken the kingdom of Macedonia from his father, Philip II, so too did Vince McMahon take the kingdom of the WWF from his father, Vince McMahon Sr. And just like Alexander the Great, Vince McMahon, at the end of it, he cried once he conquered WCW in 2001, just like Alexander the Great cried. Why did Alexander the Great cry, they say? Because there were no more worlds left to conquer. And that's the story. But Jim Crockett and the Memphis territory of Jerry Jarrett were the only two promotions to outstay Vince. But Crockett had to sell to Ted Turner anyway in 1988. So that's all, guys. That's just a brief history of wrestling. Thank you, David, for contributing. David, if you want to add anything else, if you're still watching, you can.